So I want to do an example of how to use wet blending followed by dry blending on a costume piece. So I've done this little pleated skirt here. I've got a very wet base that I've laid down with water, and I'm slowly adding in our colors, deepening my saturation, following the lines of the little pleats and shape. You can see I've drawn sort of a basic arrow to show you where I'm pretending light is coming from. So I'm using the wet blending mostly to just define the 3D shape, to give it depth and a little bit of a sense of light before I do all my detail work. Still working in color families, so in this I'm only going to be, touching things that wouldn't be awful if they blended together. So our yellows, our blues, our greens. Using blue to deepen the green into shadows, and I'll use a little bit of yellow to define the light source. But you can see that the wet blending, everything just sort of like blows out as soon as you put it down. It's very faded, and when this dries, it'll dry pretty light. Now, this yellow looks pretty bright, and I've lost some of my reserved light here in the middle, so I'm gonna go ahead and dab that back up. Which you can always do with a wet blend. If it looks like it's going heavy, you can always just pick it back up. And then touch in a couple little highlights of where the light's gonna hit these pleats with the yellow. You can see that because the pigment has a lot of water in it, it looks a little grainy right now. It'll get better as it dries, I promise. And then adding a little depth, especially down at the kick pleats in the bottom, or not kick pleats, the pleats in the bottom, how they fall over each other, and making sure that they have that sense of stacking. Going ahead and taking a blue color and using it to also do the shadows on the legs, little shoes, little socks. So this is more like a dry blend situation, right? This is pretty controlled, but I'm aware that when I go over it, this color is going to sort of fade into whatever I layer over it for skin tones. So this is dried just a little bit. I can start adding in more shadows without them blowing out as much. You can see it's not quite as wet. I like to place shadows under where all my buttons are going to be to help show that they are 3D, right? So really using the wet blending to define what our light source is, what our shape is. Starting to look like an actual pleated skirt. There we go. So then we're gonna add a little purple shadow, let that dry in the skirt area, and deepen the shadows that are in the leg area, skin tones. Using sort of a plummy purple, muddy plummy purple color for that. So now we've got that, we're gonna let that dry all the way through before we come back and touch in on a few other things, right? So we want that area up there to keep drying. So we're gonna work down here while that's drying. And start doing more of our dry brushing technique under the shoes where we have a lot of detail. It's important to let that skirt continue drying because you can see how if we kept working it, it would all go one tone. Right now it's nicely separated. The yellow has a space, the blue has a space. Now we're going to start defining the light by using the same colors we used to define the light in the skirt down here. So there's a little bit of a bounced yellow on the leg, a little bit of a bounced yellow on the toes of the sneakers. Now we can start adding some mid-tones for the skin tone. I'm using my sienna here. We don't want those to get too muddy, but you can see how the sienna mixes with the blue underneath it. It makes a darker color without actually being blue. So the top has gotten pretty dry, safe to touch now, so I'm going to use a dry brush technique to add a plaid into this little pleated skirt. So I'm making it darker, more saturated on the outside where it touches these areas that are our highlight areas. I'm actually letting the pattern kind of taper off so it's not as dark there. You can do this by using a thinner line, you can do this by using a less saturated color, but you can see that it's darker on the outsides, and then up here where there's that yellow, beautiful, light defining halo, we're not going to go as dark with our pattern. Do the verticals. So then I'm going to do the same right underneath it, same trick, but with a green to really make it seem more like a real plaid. Usually they have more than two colors, right? And you can see that it's starting to take shape. And that underpainting that we did with the wet on wet is what's giving it dimension and letting us just focus on doing these details right now. So I'm going to go ahead and pop in the dark little buttons down the front, setting them just to the side of the shadow I put down earlier, so there's a faint shadow to the side of them. Defining some of the style lines of the skirt. And now I'm taking a blue that's got a little bit of green in it and it's a little dulled out to re-saturate our shadows, and in the shadow to blend together the pattern that we painted so it's not so stark. I'm trying to mix over here on the paper so you can see what colors I'm creating. Working on the skin tone and building up some more of the mid-tones, leaving a highlight running down the shin. Make little red sneakers because that's cute. Once again, letting the white of the paper become a highlight on the sneakers where we put in that yellow, also allowing that to sort of show through in some areas so that they have a sense of light to them. So now I want to show how we could use like wet on wet blending in a very controlled way to create a movement background for this character. So I put in clear water all along the edge of this, so as I add in this pigment, it's only going to go where I put that water in. So I put clear water in. You can see I'm not nervous throwing dye or throwing pigment into there because it's not going to blur. Then I can go ahead and dab other colors and it'll spread out along that line, but it's not going to edge past where I already laid down the water, so it's not going to enter the figure that I worked so hard on. So you could use that trick of laying down the water first and then wet blending within it and anywhere that you want a more controlled blend. Little final touch line work to help us define some details here, add some shadows and contrast in the shoes. That line got a little blurry on me, but I also like it a little softer. So go ahead and pick that up. So we're almost through here. You can start to see how just using water or wet and wet blending to define it and allowing those kind of soft fades to help you shape things is a nice easy way to start defining your light, and then using your detail dry blending to really be specific with what you want.